On the evening of 26 March 1883, in the new Vanderbilt Petit Chateau at 6060 Fifth Avenue, New York, a lady's maid fastens the last pearl button on Alva Vanderbilt's white kid gloves. Gaslight glows on carved limestone and gilt mirrors. Outside, carriage wheels grind on wet cobblestones as the city's elite queue for the most anticipated costume ball of the Gilded Age. Inside, Alva stands perfectly still, practicing the angle of her chin and the tilt of her fan, not for a painter, but for Mrs. Caroline Astor, who has at last consented to come. In the morning's papers, engravings of the chateau and estimates of its staggering cost have already appeared. One New York account notes that the ball has agitated society more than any social event in years. As Alva smooths her gloves, the gesture looks like elegance. It is also a strategy. Tonight's spectacle will secure a victory, but not without a price. In the winter of 1865, in a convent school at Neuilly-sur-Seine outside Paris, 13-year-old Alva Erskine Smith pulled on stiff new gloves before morning prayers. Her mother, Phoebe Desha Smith, has brought the children here while her husband pursues cotton deals in Liverpool, part of a Southern family dislocated by the Civil War. School records and later biographical notes place Alva in a private boarding school in Neuilly, learning French, music, and deportment alongside other expatriate girls. The chapel smells of candle wax and cold stone, the nuns' correct posture with a touch to the shoulder, a straightened wrist, a reminder to keep gloves immaculate even in the chill corridor. The sound of the bell, the rustle of uniforms, the small tug at her glove before entering a room, each becomes part of a discipline she will later wield herself. Years later, Alva would recall that Paris gave her a lifelong attachment to French architecture and a fascination with how rooms can command people. The convent's narrow refectory and carefully choreographed processions show her early how space and ritual can discipline women. Every morning begins with inspection, clean hands, proper dress, silent alignment in the corridor before Mass. The nuns move soundlessly. The girls learn to do the same. The winter light through Gothic windows is perpetually gray. Snow falls on the courtyard where the girls walk in pairs during recreation, their breath visible in the cold air, their conversations conducted in whispered French. Alva's accent improves daily. Her mother has made it clear that fluency is not optional. The family's reduced circumstances make advantageous marriages essential, and a girl who can navigate European society has more options than one who speaks only English with a Southern drawl. In the dormitory at night, the girls sleep in narrow iron beds under thin wool blankets. The room smells of lavender soap and the faint mustiness of old stone buildings. Alva lies awake sometimes, listening to the other girls breathe, wondering what has become of the plantation in Alabama, whether her father will succeed in Liverpool, whether they will ever return to America. The uncertainty is never discussed, but it shapes every lesson, every correction, every hour of practice at the piano or the embroidery frame. Outside the convent walls, Paris rebuilds itself under Baron Haussmann's grand boulevards, but inside these stone rooms, the curriculum remains medieval in its precision. Alva practices her French accent, her curtsy, her posture at the table. A slip in pronunciation earns a gentle correction. Slouching brings a wooden rod placed against the spine. She learns that refinement is not ornament but armor, and that a well-practiced gesture can conceal almost anything. The nuns never raise their voices, but their expectations are absolute. Failure is met not with anger, but with disappointment, which somehow feels worse. During lessons in the schoolroom, Alva excels at mathematics and history, subjects considered unnecessary for young ladies but tolerated if pursued alongside the essential arts of music, drawing, and needlework. Her copybooks, filled with careful calculations and historical dates, suggest a mind that finds patterns and remembers details. These skills will serve her later, when she must calculate costs and coordinate contractors, when she must remember every slight and every alliance in the complex social warfare of the Gilded Age. In these quiet French corridors, the future adversary of Mrs. Astor is learning how rooms and women can be arranged. By early 1874, in a modest house on West 44th Street, New York, the Smith family's fortunes were visibly frayed. Cotton speculation has gone badly. Murray Forbes Smith now works at the New York Cotton Exchange, while his daughters face a marriage market more necessary than optional. Society columns describe the lingering charm of Southern families now living quietly off Madison Square, their daughters seen at church and modest teas rather than in lavish entertainments. The house smells of coal smoke and yesterday's tea. Velvet drapes hide windows that need repair. The carpets, once fine, show worn patches near doorways. The furniture, brought from better times, seems too grand for the cramped rooms. Alva's younger sisters share a bedroom. Her mother economizes on candles and coal. They keep one servant, an Irish girl who cooks and cleans and serves at table when guests come. The pretense of gentility must be maintained even as the bank balance dwindles. Morning shopping trips to A.T. Stewart's department stores are exercises in careful calculation. Which ribbons can be afforded? Which gloves can be mended one more season? Alva learns to assess quality at a glance, to make minor repairs invisible, to present a silk dress purchased 3 years ago as if it were new. The social geography of New York in the 1870s is unforgiving. The city's elite cluster around Lower Fifth Avenue and Washington Square. The Astors and Schermerhorns occupy brownstone fortresses that project respectability and restraint. Newly rich families from railroads and mining push northward, building larger houses in unfashionable neighborhoods, hoping proximity will translate to acceptance. The Smiths occupy an uncomfortable middle ground. Old name, no money, Southern taint from the recent war. At an evening gathering in William H. Vanderbilt's house nearby, Alva, in carefully mended silk, adjusts her gloves before being introduced to William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Later accounts note that her closest friend, Consuelo Iznaga, made the introduction that would change both women's lives. The parlor smells of coal smoke and perfume. Card tables scrape on polished floors as the Vanderbilts' new money mixes uneasily with older Knickerbocker names. Gaslight catches on diamond brooches and freshly cut flowers. Servants move through the crowd with trays of champagne and oysters on ice. William is shy, pleasant, interested in yachting and horses more than society warfare. He has recently returned from a tour of Europe where he studied architecture and collected paintings. His conversation is informed but gentle. He shows none of his grandfather's ruthless instinct for dominance. Alva sees a man who will not stand in her way. She understands that the right marriage could rescue her family from precarious respectability. The gentle tug at her glove before she meets William is part nerves, part calculation. She is entering a negotiation, not a fairy tale. Her French is flawless. Her conversation is animated, but never forward. She laughs at the right moments, listens attentively, mentions casually that she spent years in Paris, that she knows the galleries of the Louvre, that she understands the difference between Louis XIV and Louis XV furniture. William, who has just purchased several pieces in Paris, is charmed. She departs precisely when propriety dictates, leaving him with the impression of intelligence, refinement, and availability. Within weeks, calling cards are exchanged. Within months, the engagement was announced. The wedding at Calvary Church on 20 April 1875 is modest by Vanderbilt standards but lavish by Smith standards. Alva wears white satin and Brussels lace. The church is filled with lilies and roses. The newspapers note the union of an old Southern family with the Vanderbilt fortune, framing it as a romantic alliance rather than what it truly is. Less a romance than a contract written in railroads and cotton. Between 1878 and 1882, Alva, now Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt, spent long days with architect Richard Morris Hunt on the plans for a French Renaissance-style mansion at 6060 Fifth Avenue. Biographers record a contemporary's remark that she loved nothing better than to be knee-deep in mortar, a comment that survives in architectural histories of the so-called Petit Chateau. Fifth Avenue still carries a somber look of brownstone facades. Carolyn Astor's earlier house at 355th is imposing but visually restrained, a statement of established power that requires no ostentation. In Hunt's studio on Washington Square, Alva's gloved finger traces floor plans spread across a wide oak table. The room smells of drafting ink, turpentine, and pipe tobacco. Afternoon light slants through tall windows onto drawings of a great hall for receiving, a grand staircase for entrances, a ballroom large enough to rival Mrs. Astor's. Every molding and mantel becomes part of a campaign, the architecture of a family seeking entry into the 400 that social arbiter Ward McAllister has famously described as the limit of truly fashionable New Yorkers. Hunt, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, understands what Alva wants before she articulates it fully. They speak the same visual language, both shaped by French models. He brings her photographs of Loire Valley Chateau, Blois, Chenonceau, Azay-le-Rideau. She studies the proportions, the play of light on carved stone, the way stairs can make a woman's entrance a form of theater. They discuss Caen limestone shipped from France, wrought iron details forged by craftsmen in Paris, the exact angle of the porte cochere to allow carriages to discharge passengers under shelter. The sound of scratching pens punctuates their conversations. Hunt's assistants work quietly at neighboring drafting tables, rendering Alva's vision in ink and watercolor. She visits the site frequently, even during construction, picking her way through mud and scaffolding in practical boots hidden under her skirts. The workmen learn to expect her to have answers ready when she asks about progress on the carved mantels or the installation of the parquet floors. Some contractors find her demands excessive. Hunt quietly replaces them with men willing to meet her standards. The house rises slowly, expensively, spectacularly. By 1882, scaffolding still surrounded the upper floors, but the interior rooms were nearly complete. Alva walks through them with a contractor's eye, testing the acoustics of the ballroom by clapping her hands and listening to the echo, checking sight lines from the staircase to ensure that every guest will see the full grandeur of the space, ensuring that every room tells a story of Vanderbilt wealth and Vanderbilt taste. The cost escalates beyond initial estimates. William signs the checks without complaint. The dining room's paneling comes from a French chateau dismantled and shipped across the Atlantic. The drawing room ceiling is painted with mythological scenes by European artists. The library shelves are carved walnut. The books, bound in leather, are selected as much for appearance as content. Every detail serves the larger purpose. This is not merely a home, but a declaration. The house is more than a dwelling. It is a case in carved limestone that the Vanderbilts belong at the center of New York society. In contemporary photographs, the chateau looks almost out of place on Fifth Avenue, its turrets and dormers and elaborate stonework startling among the more restrained brownstones. But that is precisely the point. Mrs. Astor's house whispers power through understatement. Alva's house shouts it through beauty. Two competing philosophies of dominance, expressed in architecture. The chateau was nearly finished by early 1883. Only one door remained closed to Alva, the door of Mrs. Astor's ballroom. By the 1880s, New York's upper class was a fragile coalition of old mercantile families and new industrial fortunes. Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, backed by McAllister, polices admission through ballroom capacity. There are only about 400 people in fashionable New York society, he declares. Morning calls, calling cards, and carefully choreographed dinners enforce invisible boundaries as effectively as any wall. A woman receives on her designated afternoon. Her friends appear between 3 and 5, leaving engraved cards on silver trays. To be not at home when someone calls is a calculated insult. To fail to return a call within the prescribed week is social death. The etiquette is Byzantine in its complexity. Married women call on married women. Unmarried girls may call only when accompanied. A first call must be returned within 3 days. A longer delay suggests indifference or disapproval. The corner of a calling card, turned down at different angles, conveys different messages. Folded at the top, right indicates a personal visit, while other fold signal visits to multiple family members or condolence calls. Servants are trained to recognize these signals, to know which cards require immediate attention and which can wait. American girls of Alva's class are polished in convent schools, private academies, and increasingly finishing schools from Miss Porter's in Connecticut to Swiss institutions overlooking Lake Geneva, where languages, music, and deportment are taught as social capital. They learn which fork to use for fish, how to exit a carriage without showing an ankle, when to speak, and when to remain silent. The education is rigorous, expensive, and utterly focused on a single goal: marriage to the right kind of man. A girl might speak 4 languages and play Chopin flawlessly, but these accomplishments matter only insofar as they attract a suitable husband. The curriculum at these schools rarely includes mathematics beyond basic arithmetic or any science beyond botany. History is taught as a series of royal genealogies. Literature emphasizes poetry and edifying novels. Physical education consists of graceful walks in gardens. Intellectual development is secondary to the cultivation of charm. Girls who show too much intelligence learn to hide it. Cleverness is acceptable only if deployed in the service of pleasing conversation, never in pursuit of serious argument or original thought. Against this backdrop, Alva's new chateau and upcoming ball are not mere entertainments. They are deliberate interventions in the social economy of the Gilded Age. The architecture itself is a form of argument, asserting that beauty and grandeur can rival birth and lineage as markers of social standing. On a cold February morning in 1882, in the Petit Chateau drawing room, Alva receives her first formal calling card from a minor but well-connected matron. The card is placed on a silver tray by a liveried footman, gloved hands steady. Manuals of etiquette and society columns explain the code, whose cards one returns, how soon, and who may be received while at home. Mrs. Astor's card does not appear. The room glows with coal fire and gilt-frame mirrors. Morning light filters through lace curtains onto Persian rugs and French furniture acquired during the honeymoon trip to Europe. The scratch of pen on thick cardstock punctuates the afternoon as Alva writes her own engraved name, planning calls that edge ever closer to Astor's circle. She studies the social registers, notes who dines with whom, tracks alliances through engagement announcements and charity committees. A subscription to the opera brings contact with one family. A donation to the charity organization society opens doors with another. The calling card ritual becomes Alva's daily practice in social architecture. Each morning, her secretary brings the cards received the previous day. Each afternoon, Alva decides which calls to return, which invitations to accept, which connections to cultivate. The cards accumulate in a carved wooden box on her desk, a physical record of her expanding network. Some names she recognizes from Mrs. Astor's circle. Others are newer families, allies in the campaign for recognition. Gloves are essential. A lady does not receive or call bare-handed. Each adjustment at the wrist is a reminder that even fingertips are regulated. The gloves must be spotless kid leather in neutral colors, fitted perfectly, never wrinkled or stained. A woman's gloves are assessed as critically as her gown or her jewels. They signal care, refinement, attention to detail. Alva orders gloves from Paris, from the same ateliers that supply European royalty, in shades of cream and gray and pale lavender. Refinement, Alva sees, is a language, and like any language, it can be used to challenge those who think they own it. She has learned its grammar at Neuilly, its vocabulary in Hunt's studio, its subtle inflections through years of observation. Now, she will use it to rewrite the rules Mrs. Astor has spent decades enforcing. The chateau is nearly ready. The stage is set. All that remains is to force the performance when she draws up the guest list for the chateau's opening ball. One name, Caroline Carey, Astor, the daughter, will become her most strategic omission. On the afternoon of 26 March 1883, hours before the costumes appeared, Fifth Avenue outside 6060 was already lined with onlookers. Inside, Alva walks through the chilled, flower-scented ballroom, checking the placement of orchids, the shine on the parquet, and the position of the orchestra gallery. Ward McAllister has been consulted. The guest list approaches 1,000. Newspapers like the New York World have speculated that the ball will cost at least $250,000, a sum modern historians confirm is plausible given the documented expenses for costumes, flowers, and entertainment. The preparations have consumed weeks. Florists from across the city have delivered hothouse orchids, lilies, roses, and palms to transform the ballroom into a garden. The orchids alone represent a fortune. They have been shipped from greenhouses in New Jersey and Long Island, arranged in massive displays that soften the marble and gilding with natural beauty. The air is heavy with their scent, mixing with the smell of furniture polish and the faint odor of gas from the chandeliers being tested and adjusted. In the kitchen below, French chefs prepare a midnight supper that will include oysters, terrapin, chicken croquettes, aspic, ices molded into elaborate shapes, and champagne flowing from fountains specially constructed for the occasion. The menu, preserved in society columns, represents a catalog of Gilded Age excess, 12 courses, each paired with appropriate wines, served in china commissioned specifically for the event. Extra servants have been hired from an agency. They stand in the hallway receiving instructions, learning the layout of the house, memorizing which guests are to be shown particular attention. In later tellings, repeated by biographers and historians, the crucial detail is this: Carrie Astor received no invitation because Mrs. Astor had never called on Alva. The insult is subtle but unmistakable. Carrie has been practicing quadrilles for weeks, anticipating the social triumph of attending the season's most spectacular event. Her friends have invitations, she does not. The humiliation is public, calculated, and effective. Carrie reportedly burst into tears when she realized the omission was intentional. Her mother, understanding immediately what has happened, faces a choice: maintain pride and keep her daughter from the event, or concede defeat and make the call that Alva has been waiting for. Only when Mrs. Astor, in full social armor, makes that long-awaited visit, her card finally placed on Alva's silver tray, the footman announcing her arrival in the drawing room where Alva waits with perfect composure, do invitations go out to mother and daughter. The gesture cost Mrs. Astor nothing but pride. It cost Alva years of patient strategy. Yet when the cards are finally sent by messenger to the Astor residence at 350 Fifth Avenue, the victory is complete. Mrs. Astor has acknowledged Alva Vanderbilt as a social equal. That evening, under blazing gas chandeliers and the rustle of brocades and chainmail armor, society observers note Mrs. Astor and Alva in animated conversation, their gloved hands both resting on the same banister. Alva appears as a Venetian princess, Mrs. Astor in her customary diamonds, wearing them with the confidence of someone who has worn such jewels for decades. The ballroom holds costumes of Renaissance princes, Egyptian pharaohs, French courtiers, medieval knights, and literary characters. Photographs from the event, preserved in archives, show elaborate staging, guests posed on the grand staircase, the hall transformed into a theater of wealth and imagination. The New York Times devotes columns to describing the costumes in minute detail. Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt as electric light, with a white satin gown wired with hidden batteries to make her headdress glow. Guests as Mother Goose characters, as historical figures, as personifications of abstract concepts. The spectacle achieves exactly what Alva intended. It establishes the Vanderbilts not as supplicants seeking entry to society, but as society's new center. For the newspapers, the ball is a triumph of display. For Alva, it is the moment when obedience to etiquette turns into mastery of it. As one later quotation attributed to Mrs. Astor has it, "The time has come for the Vanderbilts." By August 1892, the sea air at Newport, Rhode Island, carried over the marble terraces of Marble House, the cottage Alva had built with Richard Morris Hunt as a birthday present for William. Constructed between 1888 and 1892 at a reported cost of around $11 million, Marble House helps transform Newport into a parade of stone palaces. The sound of the Atlantic mixes with the clink of tea service on the South Terrace. Fountains murmur in carefully designed gardens. Peacocks wander across manicured lawns, their cries echoing over the cliff walk where tourists pause to gape at the estates. Estate accounts list armies of servants, imported marble, and gilded paneling. Photographs from the period show Alva in high-necked gowns on the terrace, gloves in hand, with the ocean as backdrop. The house itself is a temple to excess. Pink marble from Algeria, green marble from Italy, yellow marble from Siena. The gold room blazes with genuine gold leaf applied to carved wood. The Gothic room suggests a medieval chapel transplanted to the Rhode Island shore. Every inch is calculated, every surface a lesson in what money can build. The ballroom's Corinthian columns are single pieces of yellow sienna marble. The bronze guest room features walls of bronze relief. Even the servants' quarters are finished with more luxury than most middle-class homes can boast. The construction required skilled craftsmen imported from Europe, Italian marble workers, French gilders, German metalworkers. They lived on the grounds during the building process, their camps visible from the main road, a reminder of the international effort required to create this monument to American wealth. Local newspapers followed the construction with fascination, reporting on shipments of marble, arriving at the Newport docks, on the challenges of installing the massive columns, on the artistry of the decorative work. Here, summer becomes a continuation of social schooling. Luncheons, teas, and dances are hosted with military precision. Young Consuelo Vanderbilt, born in 1877, is drilled in introductions, small talk, and the choreographed walk from staircase to salon. Guests arrive at noon for luncheon and do not depart until 6. The schedule is rigid, the expectations absolute. A typical day includes bathing at Bailey's Beach in the morning, luncheon at one of the cottages, afternoon calls or carriage drives, tea at another estate, and dinner followed by cards or dancing. The pace is exhausting, the performance unrelenting. Marble House is a classroom where the curriculum is hospitality, and failure means social exile. On the terrace overlooking the cliff walk, Alva supervises Consuelo's posture, her conversation, the way she holds a teacup. Nothing is left to chance. The girl must learn to charm without seeming to try, to listen without appearing bored, to dance the same cotillion figures without missing a step. She must remember names and faces, recall the details of previous conversations, navigate the complex web of family relationships and old grudges that structure Newport society. Even in sea breeze and sunlight, the clink of porcelain and the hush of servant steps underline that this is not leisure. It is labor performed in silk and kid leather. The servants move invisibly, anticipating needs before they are voiced, clearing plates the moment a course is finished, refilling glasses without being asked. Their choreography is as precise as any ballet, the result of years of training and the threat of immediate dismissal for any error. As Newport applauds Marble House, Alva begins to test how far this well-oiled machinery can serve purposes beyond Mrs. Astor's approval. On a rainy afternoon in 1892, in Consuelo's bedroom at the New York house, a governess fastens a steel rod down the young girl's spine, attaching it to a metal collar beneath her dress to correct her posture. In her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, Consuelo later described such devices as a horrible instrument and recalled how her mother emphasized obedience over comfort. Letters and recollections show Alva determined that her daughter become the perfect debutante and eventually a duchess. The training begins early and intensifies as Consuelo approaches marriageable age. The room is quiet, except for rain on the window and the faint creak of the brace when Consuelo breathes. Her gloves lie on the bed, ready for the next appearance. Even the act of slipping them on is watched. The device presses against her shoulder blades, forcing her chin up, her back rigid. Any attempt to slouch is met with immediate pain, a physical reminder of the posture expected at all times. The brace must be worn for hours each day, removed only for sleep and bathing. At dinner, she must sit straight despite the pain, her French phrases and light conversation polished by tutors hired on both sides of the Atlantic. Morning lessons include French literature with a Parisian tutor, who accepts nothing less than perfect accent and grammar. Watercolor painting with an instructor from the National Academy of Design. Piano with a German master who raps her knuckles when she strikes a wrong note. And the complexities of European genealogy taught by a historian who makes her memorize the relationships between royal houses back 3 generations. Afternoon sessions focus on deportment, how to enter a ballroom so that all eyes turn, how to acknowledge a beau without seeming too eager or too cold, how to navigate a 12-course dinner without error or hesitation. Additional tutors arrive for specialized instruction. A dancing master who drills her in the waltz, the polka, the cotillion, and the newly fashionable German. A voice coach who teaches her to modulate her tone so she is always audible but never loud. A lady's maid who instructs her in the mysteries of costume and jewels, which colors suit her complexion, which styles flatter her figure, how to coordinate a complete outfit from shoes to hairpins. Consuelo's diary, preserved in archives, records her mother's instructions. You must learn to walk as if you weigh nothing. Another entry, more resigned. I am becoming what they wish. The question of who they are will soon widen beyond her mother. The marriage market demands perfection. Any flaw could cost a title, a fortune, a future. The competition is fierce. Other American heiresses are being similarly prepared, their mothers equally determined to secure European nobility for their daughters. Here, etiquette becomes physical discipline. The techniques Alva once endured at Neuilly now pass, intensified, to her daughter. The convent nuns use touch and correction. Alva uses steel and leather. Both methods share a goal: the erasure of the natural self in favor of the socially acceptable one. It was called education, but education often meant erasure. The girl Consuelo might have been spontaneous, curious, perhaps even happy, disappears beneath layers of instruction and correction. In Consuelo's bedroom, the brace remains in place for hours. Outside, carriages pass on Fifth Avenue, carrying other young women to other lessons, other preparations for the same destiny. Inside, a girl learns that grace is not given but constructed, one painful adjustment at a time. The rain continues, the clock ticks. The governess watches, making notes on Consuelo's progress for Mrs. Vanderbilt's review. By 1894, between the Fifth Avenue house and Newport, Alva's mornings began at a writing table piled with engraved stationery and visiting cards. She drafts notes to European relatives, to agents in London, to potential in-laws, and to architects overseeing new projects like Brookholt and Belcourt. Surviving correspondence and biographical studies show an increasing focus on one project, arranging a marriage for Consuelo that will carry the Vanderbilt name into the British aristocracy. The letters multiply, filling dozens of pages each week, a paper trail of ambition and strategy. The scratch of pen on paper mixes with the faint tick of a clock and the rustle of silk. Thank you notes, invitations, and replies follow strict formats laid out in etiquette manuals. Any deviation risks offense. Yet between formulaic lines, Alva threads strategy, referencing dowries, settlements, and suitable titles. One letter to a London matchmaker mentions a daughter of exceptional accomplishment and considerable fortune. Another to a French aristocrat inquires discreetly about the marital status of various dukes and earls. The gloves resting beside the inkwell are a reminder. Every letter is an extension of that first carefully controlled handshake. The correspondence is voluminous and carefully organized. Alva maintains separate files for different categories of contacts: European nobility, American business associates, architects and contractors, social acquaintances. Her secretary helps manage the flow of paper, but the actual composition is Alva's own work. She writes in a clear, decisive hand, her sentences structured with the precision of someone who has learned that words on paper carry weight and consequence. Some letters discuss architectural details for Belcourt, the new Newport cottage designed by Hunt for her second husband, Oliver Belmont, whom she will marry after her divorce. Others negotiate social alliances, arrange introductions, or coordinate the complex logistics of the London season. which hotels offer suitable accommodations, which dressmakers can provide an appropriate wardrobe on short notice, which events Consuelo must attend to be seen by the right people. Each envelope is addressed in perfect copper plate. Each seal bears the Vanderbilt crest in burgundy wax. The ritual of correspondence, the selection of paper, the composition of phrases, the careful drying of ink before folding becomes another form of performance. Different occasions demand different stationery. Mourning requires black-bordered paper. Formal invitations use heavy cream cardstock with engraved lettering. Personal notes employ lighter paper in pale colors. The choice of paper communicates as much as the words written on it. Alva also maintains a detailed record of replies received, tracking who responded promptly and who delayed, who accepted invitations and who declined. These patterns inform future strategy. A delayed response suggests hesitation or lack of interest, while an immediate acceptance signals enthusiasm or social calculation. Every interaction is data, every encounter a piece of a larger puzzle. Refinement, once an imposed language, has become the medium through which Alva negotiates power, not just for herself, but for the future of the Vanderbilt dynasty. She has learned that architecture extends beyond buildings to encompass marriages, alliances, and the careful construction of legacy. The letters are her tools, as essential as Hunt's drawings were for the chateau. Across the Atlantic at Blenheim Palace, the ninth Duke of Marlborough is also receiving letters about money, lineage, and a possible American bride. His palace requires expensive repairs. His title requires an heir. The negotiation has begun. On 6 November 1895, the air outside St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue was crisp. Inside, incense drifted through Gothic arches as Consuelo Vanderbilt walked up the aisle to marry Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. Newspapers report that the marriage settlement includes a Vanderbilt dowry valued at about $2.5 million in railroad stock, part of a larger pattern in which wealthy American heiresses, nicknamed dollar princesses, trade fortunes for European titles. Historians like Maureen Montgomery have characterized such alliances as a form of gilded prostitution, underlining their transactional nature. The settlement also provides Consuelo with an annual income and specifies provisions for any children, ensuring the financial stability of the Marlborough estate for generations. In a side pew, Alva's gloved hands are folded tightly around a prayer book. Organ music swells. Light through stained glass colors the marble floor in reds and blues and golds. The church is filled with white roses and lilies, their scent heavy in the warm air. Consuelo's memoir later records that she was coerced, even locked in her room, until she agreed to the match, and that her true affection lay elsewhere, specifically with Winthrop Rutherford, an American she was forbidden to see. The shining satin, the blaze of candles, and the press of the crowd conceal a quieter reality. This is a carefully negotiated merger of cash and pedigree. The Duke, 23 years old, appears composed at the altar. He has visited Newport during the summer, has been entertained at Marble House, has conducted the courtship with the formality of a business transaction. Some biographers suggest he found Consuelo attractive. Others note that he never pretended the match was anything but financial necessity. Blenheim Palace, built by the first Duke of Marlborough with funds granted by a grateful nation after his military victories, requires hundreds of thousands of pounds in repairs. The roof leaks. The heating system is inadequate. The art collection needs conservation. The Vanderbilt fortune will save the palace even as it saves the Duke from financial ruin. The wedding breakfast at 1660 Fifth Avenue is lavish. Champagne flows from silver fountains. Toasts are offered in multiple languages. Telegrams arrive from European royalty congratulating the couple. Alva receives compliments on the match. Society columnists declare it the triumph of the season, the apotheosis of the dollar princess phenomenon. Yet, Consuelo's face in the wedding photographs, preserved in archives, shows no joy. Her posture is perfect. Years of training ensure that, but her eyes are distant, focused on something beyond the frame, perhaps on the life she might have had with Rutherford. The applause outside the church is real, but so is the cost to the young bride. For Alva, the success of the strategy marks both the height of her power and the beginning of a personal reckoning. She has achieved what she set out to do, secured a duchess's coronet for her daughter, validated the Vanderbilt name in the oldest circles of European aristocracy, created an alliance that will be discussed in society columns for years. But in the carriage returning from the church, watching Consuelo's rigid silence, the way her daughter's hands clench in her lap despite the perfection of her gloves, she may have understood what it cost. Whether that understanding changed anything is uncertain. By then, the contracts were signed and the marriage complete. Within months, another negotiation will unfold, this time in a divorce court, with Alva herself as plaintiff. In December 1894 and finalized in 1895 in New York, Alva filed for divorce from William K. Vanderbilt, citing his infidelity. For a woman of her rank in the 400, such an action is almost unheard of. Legal records and contemporary press accounts show that the settlement left her with substantial property, including Marble House, while William retained Idle Hour and other assets. The case proceeds with surprising speed. By March 1895, the divorce is granted in a private hearing that keeps the most damaging testimony out of public record. The courtroom, with its hard benches and dusty windows, is a far cry from gilded salons. Yet here, too, gloves matter. Alva appears composed, veiled, and impeccably dressed, signaling dignity rather than scandal. Her lawyer, a respected member of the New York bar, presents evidence of William's affair with Nellie Neustretter, efficiently and without theatrics. The judge, perhaps sympathetic or perhaps simply bowing to Vanderbilt influence, grants the divorce with minimal comment. Society gossip columns oscillate between shock and grudging admiration. The New York Times reports the proceedings with restrained language, noting simply that Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt has been granted a divorce. Other papers are less circumspect, speculating about the details of William's infidelity and wondering whether Alva's own behavior has been entirely above reproach. Some columnists predict social ruin. Others note that Mrs. Vanderbilt has always made her own rules and survived the consequences. The question of whether Alva will retain her social position after divorce consumes drawing rooms and dinner tables throughout the winter. Conventional wisdom suggests that a divorced woman, regardless of the justification, becomes unmarriageable and unwelcome. But Alva's position is unusual. She has money, property, and connections of her own. She is not dependent on William's fortune or his name for her social standing. The chateau at 665th Avenue may be his, but Marble House is hers absolutely. Biographer Sylvia Hoffert notes that Alva's willingness to challenge marital convention foreshadows her later activism for women's rights. But in 1895, the connection was not yet clear. What is clear is that Alva has chosen autonomy over respectability, wealth over social approval. The divorce papers, preserved in New York court archives, detail property divisions with business-like precision. Which estates, which accounts, which jewelry, which horses and carriages. The language is cold, transactional, the legal terminology reducing years of marriage to an inventory of assets. In leaving her husband publicly, Alva repurposes the tools she once used solely for social ascent, determination, control of space, and command of narrative, toward a different kind of autonomy. The society that once excluded her, that she conquered through architecture and spectacle, now watches as she steps outside its most fundamental rule, that a proper marriage endures regardless of personal cost, that a woman's reputation depends on maintaining appearances even in the face of betrayal. On 11th January 1896, less than a year after her divorce, she married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont in a small ceremony that society columns note with surprise and speculation. Belmont, himself divorced, shares Alva's interest in architecture and horses. Together they will build Belcourt, another Newport palace. But Alva's gaze is already turning beyond society's inner ring, toward questions about why women need permission at all. By 1900, Mrs. Astor's authority was fading. Her new chateau-like mansion at 840-841 Fifth Avenue, designed by the same Richard Morris Hunt, boasts a ballroom capable of holding 1,200 guests, far more than the original 400, but will stand only until its demolition around 1926. The old rules of exclusivity are eroding under economic change and the rise of hotels like the Waldorf Astoria on former Astor turf, built on the site of the previous Astor mansions after a family feud made their proximity untenable. The city is changing. The rigid social structure that once made a calling card a matter of survival is loosening under pressure from new fortunes, new ideas, new Americans who refuse to wait for permission. The 1890s brought economic panic and labor unrest. The panic of 1893 bankrupts thousands of businesses. Strikes paralyze railroads and factories. Newspapers carry stories of poverty that make Gilded Age excess seem increasingly obscene. Some society families, reading the mood of the nation, begin to emphasize philanthropy over parties, founding hospitals and libraries and settlement houses. Others, like the Astors and Vanderbilts, continue to entertain lavishly, but the appetite for coverage of their affairs is waning. The public is weary of reading about costume balls while workers starve. Alva, now Mrs. Belmont, continues to host, but the tone is different. At Bell Court in Newport or her New York townhouse, guest lists expand beyond the old Knickerbocker set. Surviving invitations and press items show labor leaders, suffragists, and reformers appearing alongside titled visitors and financiers. A dinner party might include a British earl, a settlement house director, and a woman who has just published a treatise on factory conditions. The conversations shift from gossip about marriages to debates about legislation, from fashion to philosophy, from who is in or out to why such distinctions matter at all. Glove adjusting before a reception still matters, but the conversations inside stretch beyond the old boundaries. The social war with Mrs. Astor, effectively winning the night of the Vanderbilt ball, has given Alva a hardened sense of how arbitrary that old hierarchy was. She spent decades learning its rules, mastering its rituals, wielding its weapons. Now she begins to question whether the victory was worth the cost, whether the system she fought to enter deserves to survive. In photographs from this period, Alva looks older, sharper, less interested in pleasing the camera. Her gowns are still elegant, her posture still perfect, but something has shifted. The performance continues, but the audience has changed. She no longer courts approval from Mrs. Astor or her circle. She courts approval from women who will never be invited to Newport, women who work for wages and fight for rights, and see Alva's wealth as something to be redistributed rather than admired. The next time Marble House's ballroom fills, it will not be for a costume ball, but for a suffrage conference. In July 1914, the chandeliers of Marble House in Newport shine not on court costumes but on banners reading "Votes for Women." Alva, now a prominent suffragist, hosts the Conference of Great Women here, following earlier suffrage lectures at the House in 1909. Archival menus and memorabilia record the use of special Votes for Women china, similar to the sets now held in collections like the Susan B. Anthony Birthplace Museum. Alva used such tea services as subtle propaganda at rallies in her Marble House Tea House, a Chinese-style pavilion she built on the grounds specifically for suffrage meetings. On this summer day, the soundscape is familiar: clinking china, murmured conversation, footmen moving through the crowd. But the content is radically different. Speeches by figures such as Harriet Stanton Blatch, daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and organizer of the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women, and Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, discuss labor laws, political rights, and the need for federal amendments. Women in simple shirtwaists sit beside women in silk. The ballroom that once enforced rigid class distinctions now attempts, however imperfectly, to bridge them. The conference program, preserved in suffrage archives, lists sessions on women in industry, the economic basis of suffrage, and political rights as human rights. Speakers include factory workers who testify to dangerous conditions and poverty wages, lawyers who explain the legal disabilities women face under coverture laws, and activists who have been arrested and imprisoned for demonstrating outside the White House. The contrast with the 1883 ball could not be more stark. Then, women dressed as historical figures for entertainment. Now, they plan to make history themselves. Alva removes her gloves before she speaks, resting them on the lectern. The gesture, once a prelude to polite conversation, now prefaces an open argument about women's autonomy. Her speech, preserved in suffrage archives, argues that women's economic dependence makes them slaves regardless of their social class. "I know what I'm talking about," she tells the crowd. "I was a slave." The statement, coming from one of the wealthiest women in America, is designed to shock. She explains that her wealth meant nothing when her husband could control it, when her daughter's marriage required negotiation like a business deal, when her own freedom came only after a costly divorce. The same marble that once served as a stage for impressing Mrs. Astor now amplifies calls for structural change. Grace has become a tool in a different kind of war, one aimed not at a single social queen, but at the legal framework that kept women dependent. Outside, protesters gather on Bellevue Avenue. Some carry signs opposing suffrage, warning that votes for women will destroy families. Others simply watch. The neighbors, members of Newport's Old Guard, do not approve of Marble House being used for political purposes, but Alva no longer requires their approval. When the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, some of the women celebrating will remember sipping tea from plates first laid out on Alva's Newport tables, discussing revolution in a palace. By the late 1920s, wrecking crews moved along Fifth Avenue. The William K. Vanderbilt House at 660 Fifth Avenue, Alva's Petit Chateau, was sold in 1926 and demolished the next year, replaced by a commercial building. The Astor Mansion at 840-841. Fifth follows around the same time, making way for modern apartments and offices. Business towers rise where card trays once sat by the door, where footmen once announced visitors, where women once waited in drawing rooms for cards that would determine their social fate. Only photographs, sale catalogs, and fragments of mantels and ironwork in museums recall the rooms that once defined who counted as society. The architecture that seemed so permanent, so inevitable, proves as temporary as the social rules it housed. The demolitions attract crowds of onlookers who come to watch the great houses fall. Photographers document the process: scaffolding. Around turrets, workers dismantling carved limestone, rubble piled in the street. Some architectural fragments are salvaged for museums or private collectors. Most become landfill. The cost of demolition is reported in newspapers alongside elegiac commentary about the passing of an era, the end of Gilded Age grandeur. But the elegies are mixed with relief. The palaces always seemed excessive. Their owners always seemed oblivious to the poverty beyond their gates. Alva died in Paris on 26th of January 1933, having spent her last decades funding suffrage organizations, paying bail for arrested strikers, and serving as president of the National Woman's Party. Her final years are devoted to the Equal Rights Amendment, which she will not live to see ratified. She maintains an apartment in Paris and continues to host, but the gatherings are working meetings rather than social entertainments, strategizing sessions for suffrage campaigns, fundraising dinners for labor organizations, planning meetings for demonstrations and lobbying efforts. At her funeral in New York's St. Thomas Episcopal Church, the same church where Consuelo was married, contemporary reports note a contingent of suffragists among the mourners, their simple coats and hats a contrast to the elaborate mourning costumes of the earlier Gilded Age. The service is brief. The eulogies emphasize her later work more than her earlier triumphs. The woman who once forced Mrs. Astor to call, who once spent a fortune on a single ball, is remembered not for a ball but for bail funds, not for her chateau but for her campaigns. In a modern museum gallery devoted to the period, a visitor might see a photograph of the 1883 Vanderbilt ball hung near a pair of white kid gloves and a Votes for Women teacup. The objects are anonymous. The labels are brief. Yet the pairing quietly narrates a full arc, from gloves worn to win entry into Mrs. Astor's world, to gloves removed so a woman could speak about dismantling it. The image that remains is not the blaze of the chateau on ball night, but a still life, gloves resting beside suffrage china under museum glass, elegant and slightly constraining even in their silence, inviting us to consider how much of grace was art and how much was armor.